Moro. Moro. Morning. It's still morning. And I hope it will still be morning when I finish. Enver made a comment about my having taught on nearly every continent. What he didn't say is that they got so annoyed with me on one continent that I went to the next. And another comment made earlier was that we had not yet heard from the students, but you hadn't yet heard from the lawyers, and watch out, because I'm a lawyer. And I'm supposed to make linkages here between what's out there, the exhibit, separate is not equal, and what we're talking about here. So I have a slightly different task, and I hope that in talking about the law and the history in the United States of unequal education, briefly, and hopefully not with too many citations to cases, I can give you a tiny picture of what has happened since the very important case, which is at the heart of the exhibit here, Brown v. Board of Education, which desegregated public schools in the United States. What has happened since then to now, and I can only cover a piece of it in 7.5 minutes, and I will try to make it in 7.5 minutes. Before I get to some of those details, he's timing me now. That's called accountability. What you don't know, again, is I have a reputation of being irresponsible. So,
these are two lawyers and
so I wrote some notes here, which was my effort to say to myself, well, what can I talk about that is relevant both to the exhibit and to the interests of the people who are going to be here today, most of whom I've had the pleasure of meeting, not only here today, but also in my visits to the Sapphire School, which have, both of them, those visits have been revelatory for me and helped me a lot to begin to understand a little bit about the South African situation. But I will not pretend to be able to speak about the South African situation with any knowledge or with any mastery or authority. I can talk a bit about the American situation. And the American situation, as the exhibit makes dramatically clear, was unfortunately quite similar to the situation in South Africa. That is, the United States had its own apartheid system with respect to public education and with respect to public accommodation. Now, it wasn't the same as in South Africa because it wasn't structured across the country, and segregation was not widely practiced in a number of places in the northern half of the country in any official sense, whereas in the southern half of the United States, segregation of educational facilities and public accommodations and the like was widely practiced. And the question that I want to try to bring to you today is how much has changed since the Brown v. Board of Education event of 1954, which was a dramatic event. It's very hard to go back in history as a visitor. If you really want there, then how do you take back a real sense of what happened? But the exhibit helps you to see something. And what happened was that from one day to the next, the United States was a different place. From one day to the next, it was no longer proper for black and brown students to be, and yellow students. These rules applied not only to African Americans, these rules applied to Chinese, and Japanese, and Filipinos, and Mexicans. It spread across the whole spectrum, the rainbow of people of a different color. So when the Supreme Court of the United States, under the leadership of the Chief Justice Earl Warren, came to the conclusion that separate education is not equal education, it is unconstitutional, there was great hope that this would transform the public schools of the United States. And in point of fact, the strategy that was used in order to create that winning victory, the strategy was fashioned by the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, the NAACP. By using the schools as the lever, the hope was to open up the whole society. And in fact, that happened, because between 1954 before, in 1965, all of the laws that kept colored people apart from the white and privileged majority were changed. So that in terms of law, I'm talking about the statutes now, in terms of law, with the passage of the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Act, 64 and 65, in principle, the United States had wiped inequality from the face of the earth in that country, in principle. Now, the sad fact is that it didn't really wipe inequality away, and certainly not in the public schools. Now, I just want to take briefly a moment to talk personally, because I said I threatened you by telling you that you're going to listen to a lawyer, and you know, a lawyer is usually somebody who spends a lot of time boring both himself and herself and the people who are listening in hopes that some judge will pay attention. But I've only become a lawyer fairly recently in my life, and even though I had thought about it earlier, I just want to share with you personally that the reason I became a lawyer, and without exaggeration, is because I was interested in issues of equality and social justice from a very early age. One of my earliest experiences and memories is as a child of 13, participating in the picketing organized by the NAACP of a shop in my hometown where people had refused to serve blacks in the town. So at 13, I was out there carrying a placard saying this is unfair treatment. And I was taught very much through the leadership of my sister, who was the real leader in the family on this issue, that you had to engage in order to make change possible. And I came to the law not as a desire to, first of all, make money, because as a small-town lawyer in Vermont, you don't make a lot of money, let me tell you. But I came to the law because I thought it would enable me to have tools that would keep me focused on the issue of social justice and trying to fight inequalities. And when I talk about the question of segregation in the United States, I talk about it because I've had a personal commitment to fighting that particular battle. I've worked in black universities, and I've learned a lot from the experience of being very much in the minority in a world that was not designed for me. And I've also learned quite a lot about how to think about it and try to do something about white privilege, which is still the problem in the United States, and I know it's also a problem in South Africa. So let me just get to a few facts. 50 years after the Brown v. Board of Education decision, the Harvard Civil Rights Project did a report, and that report has some findings which I'd like to share with you very briefly. One, there has been substantial slippage towards segregation in most of the states that were highly desegregated in 1991. This is talking about 2004, and it's still true today. And there is great variation amongst the states on the subject of desegregation. The most integrated state for African Americans, what do you think it is? Not a northern state, Kentucky. Okay? The most desegregated states for Latinos are in the Northwest. Point two, Asians are the most integrated and most successful group of students, and by far the most likely to attend multiracial schools with a significant presence of 3 or more racial groups. Although American public schools are now only 60% white nationwide, and nearly 1/4 of US students are in states with a majority of non-white students, it is also true that most white students have little contact with minority students, except in the South and Southwest. In other words, there is no mixing in the schools between white students and non-white students from almost everywhere in the United States. Not just the South, everywhere. Third finding, the vast majority of intensely segregated minority schools face conditions of concentrated poverty. We've been talking about that today. These conditions of poverty are related to unequal educational opportunity, because students in segregated minority minority schools can expect to face conditions that students in a very large number of segregated white schools seldom experience. This is the divide we're talking about, and again we come back to white privilege. Fourth, Latinos confront very serious levels of segregation by race and poverty, and non-English speaking Latinos tend to be segregated in schools with each other. So it's not a pattern that applies only to one group. There has been a massive demographic transformation of the West of the United States, which has become the nation's first predominantly minority area in terms of public school enrollment. Simply put, there are many more people now in the Western states who are not white, and that has actually heightened segregation in those schools as white people have fled from the public schools in order to keep their sense of privilege. And last, I should say that there has been, in some states with very low black populations, school segregation soaring as desegregation efforts are abandoned. So where does the United States stand in the law today in terms of segregation and desegregation? Because again, officially, segregation is illegal. But what I want everybody in this room to understand is that from the time of what's called the Warren Court, the court that decided the Brown case, there has been a retreat by the U.S. Supreme Court as it's moved further and further to the right in its position on all of these issues. So you get Earl Warren, the Chief Justice of the United States, promoting integration of public schools, and then you get an opinion offered by Chief Justice Roberts, the Chief Justice of the present court, in a recent decision, the most recent decision that we have on the subject of efforts to desegregate. Here's Justice Roberts' quote on discrimination. "The way to stop discrimination on the basis of race is to stop discriminating on the basis of race." That is what is known as a tautology, a circular argument that has no value whatsoever. And the one black justice, Clarence Thomas, basically says, we live in a colorblind society and there's no room for race in determining who goes to school. And then Justice Thomas quotes the 1896 decision called Plessy v. Ferguson, which created segregation in the first place, and he quotes it approvingly. So that's, to me, a disaster when the black justice on the Supreme Court is quoting a decision that was the decision that established segregation in the public schools. Okay? So we're looking at a court, and the court is very important to all of these issues. We're looking at a court that is now so far to the right that we're on the very edge of having the Brown decision in all practical terms overturned. So when you go back, and I do hope you go back to this exhibit, I'd like you to keep these words in mind as you think about what happened then, which was so hopeful, and what is happening now. But in spite of the fact that I have to recite these negative facts, I am not radical. I still am motivated deeply and personally by the words of Martin Luther King Jr. When in 1963 he talked about his hopes for the future, and I quote those to you. "I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. With this faith, we will be able to hew out of the mountain of despair a stone of hope. With this faith, we will be able to transform the jangling discords of our nation into a beautiful symphony of brotherhood. With this faith, we will be able to work together, to pray together, to struggle together, to go to jail together, to stand up for freedom together, knowing that we will be free one day. And when this happens, when we allow freedom ring, when we let it ring from every village and every hamlet, from every state and every city, we will be able to speed up that day when all of God's children, black men and white men, Jews and Gentiles, Protestants and Catholics, will be able to join hands and sing in the words of the old Negro spiritual, free at last, free at last. Thank God Almighty, we are free at last."